So, Sajeed, thank you very much for making time to share your insights into the future of leadership. But before we go into leadership, can you share a little bit about yourself and your background and where you're from? Where did you grow up?
Yeah. Thank you, Nick. It's really good to be here. And yeah, my background is quite varied, and in some respects, it's the variety of my background that has been a key ingredient in the way I am. So, I'm Indian by origin. I was born in Malawi. I lived in England for more than 2 decades. And I've been in South Africa for almost 14 years. So when people say to me, where are you from? It's a difficult question to answer. I often say that I'm sort of international. And actually by nature, I hate to be put in a box as well. So, and we have a tendency as people and as a society to want to put people in a box, and I think that's one of the issues we face today. So long story short, I've been in different places. I come from a multicultural background, and that's probably one of the reasons why I'm at my most comfortable in a place like South Africa, which is somewhat of a melting pot, sometimes an uneasy melting pot, but it's the diversity of cultures which really appeals to me.
So you are a cosmopolitan citizen.
Yes, by definition.
So tell us, what was your dream career when you grew up?
You know, I was a dreamer. In fact, I made it a point that I almost became a professional dreamer. And my family used to actually worry about the fact that I spent so much time daydreaming. I have a very fertile imagination, and I spent many hours just, imagining, creating things, etc. I don't think I had a particularly clear view of where I wanted to go. Some of it was influenced by my family, and my family were quite varied, but they tended towards the professions. So my father was an accountant, but he'd been a businessman before that. That's a long story. My brothers went into accountancy, my uncles were lawyers. So there was almost an expected route that I was meant to take. So in some respects, my dream didn't really mature much in that environment. It was only after I started my accountancy that I realized how much I hated it. So I started in KPMG, became an accountant, and the day I qualified, I left. It was a fantastic discipline to have, but it didn't really sit well with my nature and my character. It was far too linear and static.
So tell us, who inspired you early on in your career?
Well, I was always, I used to read a lot, and I used to read a lot of the biographies of great people, even as a child. So one of my great heroes was not Napoleon, but Nelson, who was a great admiral in the British Navy. And again, it was the qualities of courage, being bold, being willing to take risks, happy to be different and happy to be a maverick. And those were the qualities that really appealed to me. As my career sort of grew, and I realized that I wasn't necessarily somebody who fit easily into a profession, I embraced the idea that I could be more than one thing. And at various points in my life, there have been people who've had an impact on me. Mandela has had a big impact on me because of the scale of what he achieved purely by being himself. Richard Branson was somebody who I used to look up to and who I ended up working with for a period of time. And I learned a lot in that journey as well. But I've also realized that most people have feet of clay. And the term being that, we look at people and we put them on pedestals, and actually Nobody is perfect. Most people have flaws. And when you get close up, you realize that they're as human as you are. So you stop, as you get older, putting people on pedestals. You start seeing them for what they are, and actually becoming less judgmental of their flaws as well, because everybody has shortcomings. And I realized that I had huge shortcomings later than I probably should have in my sort of, as I reached 40. So that journey has been an iterative journey. There have been many ups and downs, but in many ways that's been the greatest sort of learning environment for myself in terms of developing a better understanding of myself, self-awareness, but also getting to understand people a lot better.
And looking back over your career, what was a major turning point?
You know, Nick, I've realized also that we try to create narratives of major turning points or a turning point. I think there have been multiple. In fact, some of the turning points didn't seem like they were turning points until I looked back and realized that that was a turning point. So we almost unconsciously take an avenue or a route without knowing where it will lead us. And in some ways, that's what makes life exciting, right? So for me, my career has been a network of crossroads, as it were, where I've made decisions. But in most cases, the best or most amazing outcomes have happened almost accidentally. Whether it was me joining Barings the bank, or coming to South Africa on the drop of a hat, or ending up sort of finding my wife. It all happened without there being a particular huge plan of action or premeditation. So I could sit here and tell you all about those things, but I think I'm much more you will find it a lot more interesting for us to talk about specific events or outcomes, because I think life is like a tree. It's got a trunk and many branches, and the branch that you follow will lead to other parts of your existence, of your life, all connected to the trunk, but you may end up on a different part of the tree to what you envisaged.
And what is driving you today?
So as one grows older, you realize that material wealth is overrated. And I guess it's a bit sort of related to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. As you deal with survival, you start looking at different elements, and then you're into self-actualization. And for me, self-actualization is actually taking what I've learned and imparting it to people who are embarking on their careers, on their life, but also sharing those insights in creating fantastic ventures of extraordinary value. So I believe that everything we do has to have a function to it, it has to have a purpose to it. I realize that my greatest creativity is applied or seems to come to the fore when I'm working with businesses and I'm able to unlock value. So I continue to aspire to do that, but I'm much more focused on venture capital and new ventures where the ability to unlock value and create exponential value is something that is central to my purpose now.
Now, let's talk about leadership. What does the future of leadership mean to you?
So, I believe that we are living in an increasingly networked and therefore democratic world. In other words, the concept of hierarchies in the way they existed 10 years, 20 years, 100 years before is disappearing. Because of the network effect, there is actually no one person, no one institution, that has everything, or is the single source of truth, or is a single source of value. And I think the internet age and the age of networks is creating a highly complex environment, which means that as individuals we've got to realize that we don't have a monopoly on the truth, that we don't know everything, that there is great liberty and freedom in proclaiming that I don't know, but I'm willing to learn and experiment. And in that environment, it's by definition an environment of interaction, of giving and taking and relating and collaborating. So the future of leadership is having the ability to recognize and see complexity for what it is, recognize one's own limitations, connect with the right people, and be able to leverage a group of people in a collaborative and equal manner, where it's not about doing it by diktat, by control, by manipulation. And that requires a level of maturity, it requires a level of humility, it requires the ability to be willing to live with ambiguity and uncertainty. And it means that you often have to suspend your judgment. Because once you judge something, you force it into a particular expectation. And inevitably, life is more complex and interesting than that. So complexity and ambiguity are going to be two constants in the future. As a leader, you have to navigate your way through them with a light touch, knowing your own limitations.
Now, what have you learned from your own journey that you consider most important for building future leaders?
I've learned that status is overrated. So when I was briefly the CEO of Virgin Mobile, although I enjoyed briefly the status of being CEO, I hated every minute of it. Because what I realized is that to be a leader, you have to work with people around you. You have to have patience, and you have to be able to sell your vision so that people can see it and relate to it. I did not have the maturity at that time to do that. And I was unwilling to spend the time and effort in nurturing that alignment. And so what I realized is that that shortcoming meant that for my tenure as a CEO of Virgin Mobile was short. But it ended up being probably, going back to earlier, the key turning point in my life. Because then I went into a deep process of self-assessment. Why was I where I was? What happened? What brought it about? How much of that was as a result of my own self-sabotage? How much of it was circumstantial? And I realized that ultimately, we are the creators of our own reality. And life is a series of lessons. It's not a series of wins or failures. If we can take those lessons and learn about ourselves and about our environment, then we are always the winner.
Now, Sajeed, when you speak to aspiring leaders and maybe even your own children, what do you tell them they should focus on for future-proofing their career, if that is possible?
I expose my children to as many things as possible, because what I do say to them is that, and what I do say to most people is that we need to expose ourselves to a multiplicity of impacts. It is through that exposure that our brains develop the capacity to understand different things and connect the dots differently. That ability to do that gives you a competitive advantage. Future leaders need to recognize that the concept of a single profession or a single job or a single career is redundant. They need to understand that the world is much more complex, as I mentioned earlier, that it's non-linear, and they need to make leaps of imagination, which can only happen if you have realized that the world is much more complex and interesting than just linear, professional, shall we say, conventional, silo-based education or teachings or careers, because all of those things, our institutions are designed to make us think in straight lines, in silos. And because our institutions are like that, we end up becoming like that. Unless you're willing to go against the grain, which a few of us do, and say, I'm not going to be put in a box. I don't want to be like everybody else. Be willing to be different. Be willing to say no. And be willing, and that's what I say to my children, don't be a sheep. Don't be a follower. Whatever you do, decide why you want to do it, and if everybody else says no, still do it. Because you've got to go from a position of authenticity, not a position of compliance or convention, because that is what creates, what I call replicas, unoriginal people, people who are simply robotic, because if you can be replicated, if you are the same as everybody else, you'll definitely be overtaken by a machine at some point.
Absolutely. Now, Sajeed, talking about technology, what are the tools of technology that you envisage will be driving leadership in future?
So, Nick, my view is that I'm coming to the conclusion that technology, with all the hype around it, needs to be understood from the position of its impact on you, and one needs to develop a good understanding of what makes technology work. But it doesn't mean you have to be a coder, for example. But I encourage leaders and my children also to do a bit of coding, because that builds an understanding of what makes a machine work, but it doesn't mean you have to be a programmer or whatever else. It just develops a lexicon, a vocabulary with which you can start understanding some of these things. Having said that, you may know that, for example, AWS, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft, they're all creating cloud-based services which are offering tools and widgets, etc., which are replacing coding. So as a non-coder, I can go in and create my own programs and my own blockchain, for example, using these platforms. So you don't have to be a coder, but you need to understand what the impact of these things is. There's a few things that I think are going to be fundamental to the future of society. I think artificial intelligence is almost like electricity. It's going to happen, and it's happening and replicating, and it's just taking over vast swathes of our society. Machines are becoming more efficient, optimized, self-learning, etc., and that's going to happen. And there is going to be an attendant impact on employment and what people will end up doing. I think that's a given. But the one technology that I'm particularly preoccupied with and also interested in is blockchain. And the reason why I believe blockchain is fundamental is that the more I study it, and I mean, when I say blockchain, there's a lot of blockchain around. IBM has got its own blockchain. Microsoft's creating its own blockchain in Azure. And there's a whole host of others. I believe that the Bitcoin blockchain is the main one. And the reason why I believe that, based on my readings and my research, is that it is the only one that is truly decentralized. It is immutable. Nobody's control of it. It is cryptographically protected and controlled. And it's the longest blockchain. It's got the most proof of work behind it. So to try and change it and to modify it would require vast amounts of resources. And no one person determines what happens to it. Now, why is that important? The future, as we said, is decentralized or networked. The idea of having one point of control or one point of failure is creating these situations where it's a winner-take-all scenario. So if we look at what we call the FANGs, Facebook, Amazon, Google, etc. Microsoft. They've become these platform companies that are essentially sucking up all of the wealth, liquidity, data that the world has, and they're centralized. I don't think that's a sustainable structure for society, because it is prone to abuse, and we saw that with Facebook already, and that's only the tip of the iceberg. Google is probably far more, shall we say, in breach of data laws than what appears to be the case, because of the way they seem to be mining it. That'll come to the fore at some point. So what I'm saying is that when you've got these single points of failure or control or power, you've got an unsustainable society going forward. When you've got a decentralized structure, it creates a democratized approach. And that's why I believe the Bitcoin blockchain could end up becoming one of the big factors, foundations to a decentralized society, where we've got a much more equitable distribution of power, wealth, and capability. And so for me, that's a fundamental driving force in the future.
Can you maybe give us a prediction of where Bitcoin is going to go in terms of the...
So, Nick, I'll give you a binary view, and which may sound that I'm hedging my bets, okay? But I believe that Bitcoin is probably going to remain within the 3 to 7,000 region, 8,000 region for the next few months. I think that towards the end of 2018, there's going to be certain things that are going to happen, whether they're stock market crashes or whatever, where Bitcoin is again going to go into a what I'd call a parabolic trajectory. I reckon that within the next year to 2 years, Bitcoin's probably going to be worth $50,000, and within the next 5 years, it may go down to zero, or it'll be worth between $400,000 and $500,000.
Okay, so there's a lot of possibilities.
There's a lot of possibilities. What I'm saying is that something could happen that could just destroy what Bitcoin is, but I think the more I look at it, the more unlikely that's going to be. And that'll mean that it'll go down to zero. On the other hand, if it turns the corner, it's got so much momentum and so much infrastructure behind it that it will become it'll become a sort of center of gravity towards which other things gravitate.
Now, let's touch on social media. When you speak to future leaders, and again maybe your children, how do you advise them to go about social media?
I tell my children not to use Facebook at all. Okay, I think Facebook, in my view, is a corrosive influence on society. It is destroying our capacity to engage at a meaningful level. We're becoming a society of voyeurs that are simply opting out of real thinking and spending our lives simply surfing and looking at what other people are doing. It's leading to a society of sensationalists. Social media has a lot of benefits because of the way it helps people to connect, but I think the disadvantages of it at the moment far outweigh the benefits. I think as a society we're not mature enough to be able to deal with it. I know friends and I know colleagues who give their children full use of social media, and the children are constantly glued on it, glued to it. And I think that that's essentially robbing them of their lives. Yeah, I am susceptible to it as well, so I go onto Twitter, or I may go onto LinkedIn, and from time to time all of us tend to do that, I think, because of its addictive nature. And you think you're going to spend 2 minutes on that and you end up spending an hour. And what I realize is that when I've done that and I come away from it, and I'm trying to relate to reality, and I've used this analogy before, reality then feels like trying to eat a sweet with a wrapper on, because you're not getting the immediate stimuli. Social media is sort of immediate, and you're there, and you sort of a voyeur, and you're looking at what's happening, and you're getting affirmations and yeses and likes and all of these things immediately or whatever, and that sort of gives you a hyper sense of reality, which is totally false. So what social media is doing is it's attenuating, it's weakening, it's dulling, it's blunting our capacity to relate at a human level.
Now, throughout your career, you've been a mentor to many future leaders. Can you maybe share a success story or two where you mentored somebody and that person took your advice to heart?
Yeah, you know, Nick, I've also realized that I have found that I've ended up mentoring people without knowing I've mentored them, right? It's through the interactions that I've had with them, or what I may have said to them in a meeting, or how I may have explained a particular thing. And years later, it's come back to me and they said, you know, when you said that, I really thought about it and made a big difference. I haven't sat down and said, you know, I'm now mentoring you and I think you should do this. I've done that now, but to me, the orchestrated mentoring environment is not necessarily the one that is most fertile for creating future leaders. It's probably about in the year 2000, so 17, 18 years ago, during the dot-com boom, I was well ahead of the curve and I was launching a wellness company in London. Probably 15, 20 years ahead of its time. It was called Well Forever, and it was to actually provide a complete sort of solution to improve your health and wellness to executives and business people, etc. And there was a young boy, probably early 20s, who I gave the chance to put the website together for me. And in that process, we had many discussions, and he did put it together, and I ended up sort of talking to him about his other businesses and what he was doing. Anyway, and then in 2003, I left England and came to South Africa. And probably about 6 months ago, he calls me and says, you know, do you remember we met 15, 20 years ago and we did this? No, I do remember him. And he says, you know, you were amazing in the guidance that you gave me, and I can't even recall what I said to him. But today he's just about to list his company on the UK Stock Exchange.
Really?
Yeah. So for me, that was a fantastic affirmation that you may say one or two things that you don't think are important, but they could have a massive impact on people around you.
Absolutely. Now, Sajeed, can you tell us who are the role models of leadership, or maybe books about leadership that you would...
So let me tell you, the books that I would recommend, which have had a massive impact on me, are Synchronicity. I can't recall the exact author, but you could look it up. The Black Swan by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. Skin in the Game by him as well. And Anti-Fragile. Those three are very, very influential in my thinking. I liked one or two of Malcolm Gladwell's books, The Tipping Point, and Outliers, which I found was very interesting. Black Box Thinking, which I mentioned earlier. I have a very strong sort of interest in Sufism. So for me, one of the greatest writers around Sufism is a poet called Rumi, and he's, for me, somebody who captures so many things at the same time: the way we live our lives, our spiritual quest, what we are often tripped up by, what we should be looking at. So I found that an extremely important reference point for my life.
Now, Sajeed, how can people get hold of you, and where can they follow you?
So I'm on LinkedIn. I'm also on Twitter. I'm just on the verge of launching two businesses. One is called Venture Catalyst. And Venture Catalyst is quite a unique organization, which is building a platform that would allow corporates to get into venture capital. But we provide a complete service from guiding a corporate on venturing into new businesses. We create advisory boards. we provide input on strategy, we've built distribution networks behind them, but we also have created a fantastic structure which can mitigate the capital required for corporates to do that using something called a Section 12J. So that's Venture Catalyst, which is going to be launching in the next few weeks. And the other business is called Alchemy, A-L-K-E-M-I, which is in the business of using tools to enable professional services businesses, whether they're lawyers, accountants, or even any corporate, in being able to take that information, putting it onto platforms, and optimizing that information to create intelligence and therefore improve their performance.
Now, Sajeed, last but not least, is there one piece of advice that you would really like to convey to future leaders?
Yes. Be ready and willing to say, I don't know. Because there's great freedom and liberty in being able to proclaim your ignorance on things and being willing to learn. Because the moment you say, I don't know, you're also saying, I'm willing to learn.
Well, Sajeed, thank you so much for
Thank you.
sharing your insights and your wisdom and helping us build a better world.
Fantastic, Nick. I've really enjoyed it, and thank you for your insightful questions, and good luck with the future of leadership.
Thank you.